Delegates at the Scottish Labour conference in Glasgow have backed calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The motion demands an end to rocket fire into and out of the territory, the unconditional release of Israeli hostages, the restoration of essential supplies and a pathway to peace. But the move puts Scottish Labour at odds with the party at Westminster. This afternoon, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said the fighting in Gaza had to end, but he stopped short of calling for an immediate ceasefire. Here's our political correspondent, Charlotte Rice.
The Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar has been calling for months for an immediate end to fighting in Gaza. That position has now been formally adopted by his colleagues in Scotland. But in Westminster, the Labour leader Keir Starmer has stopped short of this. Sir Keir has previously called for a sustainable ceasefire, but has faced pressure to explicitly back an immediate one. In an interview at the Munich Security Conference, he did not go that far.
We do need to get to a ceasefire. We all want a ceasefire. The question is, how do we get there? The fighting has to stop. Any assault on Rafah must be repelled. We must not allow that to go ahead.
The Labour leader's position on this will be tested next week too. On Wednesday, the Scottish National Party will bring forward a fresh vote on the issue in the House of Commons. In a similar vote last year, Sir Keir suffered a major rebellion, with 56 of his MPs voting for an immediate ceasefire. It's not yet clear how he'll direct his MPs to vote next week.
Tens of thousands of pro-Palestinian demonstrators are gathering in central London for a march calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The organisers expect as many as 250,000 people to attend the protest, which will take place near the Israeli embassy. Our correspondent Louisa Pilbeam is at Marble Arch, where the protest is getting underway.
The atmosphere here is calm and peaceful, but as you can probably hear, people are being vocal. There are many families with children and it's busy. The demonstration is the first in the area of the Israeli embassy since the protest was held 2 days after the October the 7th attacks on Israel by Hamas, a group designated as a terror organisation by the British government. The Met Police say there will be an exclusion zone of 100 metres around the Israeli embassy and anyone entering it will be arrested. Around 1,500 officers are on public order duty, policing this march as well as other events.
Hundreds of people are marching through Newport and Port Talbot in South Wales to protest at the proposed loss of thousands of steelworkers' jobs. Last month, Tata Steel said 2,800 jobs across the UK were at risk as it was closing both blast furnaces at its site in Port Talbot. Our reporter George Zielinski is there.
The message from Port Talbot here today is loud and clear. Save our steel. Hundreds of Tata workers are expected to gather in the town in support of an industry that's forged communities as well as the steel it's famous for. It comes after Tata announced plans to reduce emissions at the site, putting nearly 2,000 jobs at risk. Tata say the current business is unsustainable, with the existing iron and steel making operation here in Port Talbot contributing to losses of £1.7 million a day. But with so many job losses also being proposed, people here say that's a price they're unwilling to pay.
Sport. India are in full control of the third test against England after a dramatic collapse. And in football, Brentford and Liverpool have kicked off a bumper Premier League weekend. With a roundup of the action, here's Jonathan McKeith.
Yes, it's been a very difficult day for England's men's cricketers in India. Ben Stokes' side suffered that dramatic collapse from 207 for 2 to 319 all out. The hosts then had an excellent session with the bat to close in Rajkot with a lead of 322 runs with 8 second innings wickets remaining. More from our correspondent Jonathan Agnew.
Yeah, really bad day for England. They really should have set their stalls out to bat the day. They've scored maybe 300 runs. They'd have had a nice little lead over India had that been the case, but it wasn't, of course. They got bowled out. Some really poor shot selection there, 8 for 112. India have closed on 196 for 2. So they lead by 322 runs. Jaiswal had to retire hurt. He's done his back. He was on 104. He put on 155 with Gill, who's there on 65, and that Watchman Kuldeep is on 3. So what can England do tomorrow? They'll be desperate for wickets. 196 for 2. That's a lead for India of 322 runs with 2 days still to go.
Manchester City boss Pep Guardiola says he's expecting one of the toughest games of the season this afternoon when they host Chelsea in the Premier League. It ended 4-4 when the sides met in the reverse fixture at Stamford Bridge back in November. Guardiola isn't expecting things to be any more straightforward this time around.
It's an exceptional team. Exceptional in all departments. One of the toughest games we have until the end of the season. It's playing really good. The last games is playing really good. They have everything. It's intense and quality, and most of the teams define if they are able to don't lose the balls, and it's difficult to find a player that can lose the balls, and we're a really good team. Tough one tomorrow.
In the early kick-off, leaders Liverpool have just gone 1-0 up at Brentford. And in rugby league, the former dual-code England international Sam Burgess will take charge of his first game as head coach of Warrington Wolves this afternoon as they travel to play Catalan Dragons in their Super League opener.
Jonathan McKeith. A Star Wars script which Harrison Ford left at the London flat he rented during filming in the 1970s is going up for auction today. The incomplete and unbound draft, for what was then titled The Adventures of Luke Starkiller, is being sold by the flat's owners. Jonathan Terode from Excalibur Auctions says it's a big deal.
This is the first time one of these scripts has come to market attributed to one of the three lead characters, and the story behind it is incredible because they refer to it as a wonderful summer with Harrison staying with them. They would drink in the garden with him. Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher would come round and see him, but they just kept all these bits and pieces as a memento of that time.
Japan's defence ministry says it will allow recruits to have longer hair from April to try to attract more young people to the military. Under current regulations, male recruits are required to have a buzz cut and females must have short hair. The headlines again. The family of the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny are demanding that the authorities hand over his body after being formally notified of his death. Ukraine's President Zelensky has told Western leaders at a security conference that Russia is waging war against any rules at all. BBC News.
On BBC Radio 4,
I want to talk about a very different revolution that is taking place right now, quietly sweeping the globe without bloodshed or conflict.
I'm Misha Glennie, and I'm telling the story of the microchip and how it has been driving geopolitics for over half a century. Why have wars been won and are still being fought over something no bigger than a fingerprint? And how will this minuscule technology decide our futures? The Rise and Rise of the Microchip on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds begins next Thursday afternoon at 4.
Now on Radio 4, time for Any Questions with Alex Forsyth.
Hello and welcome to Hope Valley, a haven for hikers and lovers of all things outdoors, with some of the finest views and villages in the Peak District. We are at Hope Valley College, a comprehensive school that opened in 1958 after decades of campaigning for a school for this rural community. Now it has 550 students who travel from across Derbyshire, as well as Sheffield and Greater Manchester. And in true Peak District style, its curriculum incorporates outdoor pursuits, including orienteering and mountain biking. Panel, we won't make you partake. On our panel tonight, we have Esther McVeigh, the Conservative MP for Tatton and Minister without portfolio in the Cabinet Office. Unofficially, she's been called the Minister for Common Sense. Esther trained as a lawyer, then worked as a producer and broadcaster before first being elected in 2010. She was a minister in both David Cameron and Theresa May's governments, and before her recent return to government, she hosted a show on GB News. Alison McGovern is the Labour MP for Wirral South and Shadow Minister for Employment and Social Security. She grew up on the Wirral and studied philosophy at university in London. Before becoming an MP, Alison used to work as a House of Commons researcher and handle communications at Network Rail. She was also Gordon Brown's Parliamentary Private Secretary. Mark Littlewood is Director of Popular Conservatism, a campaign group which was launched last week by the former Prime Minister Liz Truss and says it advocates for conservative values. Previously, Mark was Director General of the Institute for Economic Affairs think tank for 14 years. He's also a former campaigns director for the human rights group Liberty, and until 2007 he was head of media for the Liberal Democrats. And Sonia Soda is a columnist and chief leader writer for The Observer. She's also worked for the think tanks Demos and the Institute for Public Policy Research and the consumer group Which. And she was advisor to the former Labour leader Ed Miliband until 2012. Sonia has written for a variety of publications, including the Sunday Times, the Daily Mail, the New Statesman and Prospect magazine. And she's a trustee of the philanthropic foundation The Trust for London, a charity which seeks to reduce poverty and inequality. Hope Valley, please welcome your Any Questions panel. Right, let's get things underway with our first, which comes from Joe Powis. Hello, Joe.
Hello. Anna Politkovskaya, Boris Nemtsov, the people of Ukraine, and today Alexei Navalny. Who will stop Putin murdering his critics?
Joe, thank you for your question. So you mentioned there a journalist who was murdered in 2006 by contract killers, a former deputy prime minister who was shot inside the Kremlin, and of course Alexei Navalny, who was reported dead on Friday. Already President Joe Biden has said that while the US still doesn't have formal confirmation, he's no doubt that Putin is responsible. Esther McVeigh.
Reading those lists of names there, it just highlights what a tyrant, what an aggressor, a ruthless individual Putin is. And there can be no capitulation when you're dealing with somebody like that. Hence, I'm proud of our country standing up and supporting Ukraine. And I think Putin's taken to the airwaves as well with his views on what he thinks about Biden and how he supports Biden. I thought, gosh, he's a master of the dark arts too. You can't believe a word that he says, and it makes you question everything that he does and he says. So I'm saying we need to stand up to the tyrants of the world. And you're quite right, you can't let a bully keep bullying, because otherwise they don't stop.
Esther, you talked there about the government's support for Ukraine. Do you have concern that perhaps some of that support across the wider West is wavering? We've seen, for example, the difficulties in the US with getting another aid package through in support for Ukraine.
Well, people will be thinking, where does it go from here? And I guess you've always got to think, what is the end game? But we've got to stand shoulder to shoulder against a tyrant, against a bully, and that's what we have done. And I think we were first in there, first to support them, and I believe we do need to do that until the bitter end.
Esther, thank you. Alison McGovern.
Yeah, I think Joe puts the question in those terms, rightly reading out those names, and the question, who will stand up against Putin? The answer, we all must. We all must. We've got to stand firm with the people of Ukraine. It's absolutely appalling what has happened to an incredibly brave man who was prepared to stand up against Putin, and it's dreadful news to hear today. I think we have to be absolutely clear in our support for the people of Ukraine. I'm proud that we have, as a nation, supported that, and that we provided training through the British Armed Forces. I think that's a good thing. We have to keep firm, and we all must stand up against Putin.
A tweet from the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace on Friday listed a list of potential actions that the UK could take, including, for example, further sanctions on Russia. Is that something you would support, Labour would support?
I haven't seen that tweet, but to be honest, I think we should look at every possible avenue. As I said, we've got to stand firm in our support for the people in Ukraine and look at every avenue. So I haven't seen Ben's tweet, but I'm sure that this will be discussed in the House of Commons next week, and we will be looking for those opportunities to show that support and do more to stand up against Putin.
Thank you. Mark Littlewood.
Putin leads a vile, kleptocratic government that is run along the sort of lines that you'd expect a mafia outfit to be run, and behaves in that fashion, added on with a dose of rather unpleasant far-right Russian nationalism. I don't disagree with what Esther and Alison have said about standing firm in alliance with Ukraine, but that wasn't quite Joe's question. It's who will stop him in Russia. And if you want to bring that about, it will have to be the Russian people themselves. I don't have any particular insight in how to assist them, get to them, or support the opposition, which Putin is determined to execute. But that's ultimately where change needs to come from in Russia. Even if the West stands firm and we prevail in Ukraine, we need to help the opposition in Russia to somehow dislodge Putin.
Right, but how do you do that in what has become an increasingly repressive regime?
Well, I mean, I think you've got to provide aid and support alliances with those who wish to protest the Putin regime. We have done these sort of things before. We assisted dissidents in the Soviet Union as the West. I would want us to now do the same. This isn't just a regime that we might find morally unpleasant. It's a regime which is actually threatening to international security, far beyond what's happening in the Ukraine. This guy controls nuclear weapons. And we need to take that extraordinarily seriously, and I think be unapologetic about supporting the decent Russian resistance of the Russian people wherever we can find it.
OK, Sonia Soda.
I totally agree with that, and I think when you take a step back and consider what Navalny's death means, it's a huge tragedy, but I think it's also a very sobering reminder that Putin is a dangerous man. He's dangerous for dissidents like Navalny, he's dangerous for the people of Ukraine, but he actually poses a massive threat to the West. And this is why when we talk about supporting dissidents in Russia, or when we talk about supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainian effort, we absolutely should do that for the people of Ukraine, but it's also very much in our self-interest. Now, I'm no fan of the government generally. I'm no fan of Boris Johnson. I think he was a terrible Prime Minister, coming from the Observer. I'm sure that's not a surprise to many of you. But one thing that I do agree with Esther on, actually, is that I think we should be proud as the UK. I think Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak have done the right thing with regards to supporting Ukraine. But I look at support elsewhere. I look at what's going on in the US, where the Republicans in the House are sort of holding up an aid package to Ukraine. It's become an issue of domestic politics, a bargaining chip in US domestic politics. I think you can see support waning elsewhere from some of our European allies as well. And I think we've just really got to take a very hard look at this, because Putin cannot be allowed to prevail in Ukraine, because we've got no idea where that ends up. So I think the UK has to continue to put pressure on allies in the US and in Europe. We just cannot let up in our support for the Ukrainians.
And what does that pressure look like? What does that pressure look like? Because, of course, I mentioned that aid package, which has been approved by the US Senate, but looks like it's going to run into obstacles in the House of Representatives, and the EU aid package, which has been agreed, but in the face of opposition from Hungary. So what specific actions do you think that ministers in the UK should be taking to ensure continued support for Ukraine, if that's the position?
Well, I think it's a lot of diplomatic behind the scenes that we perhaps wouldn't always know about as citizens. I mean, David Cameron did try a new tactic, which some of you may have seen in the last 48 hours or so, and he got told quite politely where to go by a US lawmaker. But I actually think it is important to put that sort of pressure on, because at the end of the day, I mean, we sort of stand together, or we don't stand at all against a man like Putin. So I think it is really all the behind-the-scenes stuff that we can possibly do.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. And Joe, thank you very much for your question. Before we move on, I want to let you know that I will be taking your calls on any answers on Saturday. So if you want to give me a call and share your thoughts on this or anything else that we end up discussing through the course of the programme, then please do. The number you need is 03700 100 444. Right, our next, which comes from Pat Quinn. Hello, Pat.
Hello. With the increasing factionalisation of the Tory party and the strong showing of reform in last night's by-election results, is the party facing its own extinction rebellion?
Pat, thank you. So we had two by-elections on Thursday. Two by-elections on Thursday, two defeats for the Conservative Party, a majority of more than 18,000 overturned in Wellingborough by Labour, a majority over 11,000 overturned in Kingswood by Labour, and as you say, Reform UK, which is the party formed out of the Brexit Party, polled at 13% and 10% in those two by-elections. Is the Tory party facing its own extinction rebellion? Mark Littlewood.
Well, the most optimistic message I heard from a Conservative MP this morning was somebody texted me to say, Mark, the results are not a catastrophe, but they are a disaster. And that was considering putting some positive spin on them. Look, there's no doubt the Conservative Party is an extraordinarily low ebb, not just in comparison to other governments that have been in power for more than a decade and have perhaps run out of steam, almost against any opinion polls that you might wish to name. And the Reform Party is peeling away some Conservative votes. I don't think we should fall for the view that everybody who voted Reform Party would otherwise have voted Conservative. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. But you know what? Well, we're in a place called Hope at the moment. I wouldn't write off anybody's prospects. British politics has never been so febrile. I think that the loyalty that voters show to any given party, whether that's Labour or Conservative or one of the others, is a lot thinner than it used to be. So even parties that are doing very well, the Labour Party at the moment, probably have support that is a mile wide, but perhaps only an inch deep. I am a betting man, and I will readily concede that the prospects of the Conservatives prevailing at the next election are a very, very long odds bet. But you know what? Things change quite quickly. The Labour Party at the last election got its worst result since the 1930s. They're now assumed to be a walk-in to be the next government. In 2017, Theresa May was on course to win a massive landslide. She didn't win a majority at all. So most importantly, over the next months, I guess the election will be in November, it's going to be up to you. But the Conservatives have a long, long march back and a lot of trust to rebuild if they want to have any hope whatsoever.
Right, and the other part of Pat's question was about increasing factionalism of the Tory party. Do you think your so-called popcorn group is helping?
Well, I hope so, because I'm rather in favour of factionalism if it's about ideas, actually. I think major political parties should have within them different cohorts who have different analyses.
I mean, there's a lot in the Conservative Party at the moment.
That's great. I think that's terrific. I don't think there's any problem with the Conservative Growth Group or the One Nation Group or my own group, Popcorn, putting forward different policy ideas. Where it gets toxic for any party is when there's a circular firing squad around the personalities and the leadership of that party. I think that's when the electorate get irritated and cheesed off, that it's all about who can climb the greasy pole. But in terms of putting ideas forward, I want to see the Conservative Party as a very broad church, although some of you might think that it's such a broad church at the moment that it's practically a cathedral.
OK, Mark, thank you. Esther McVeigh.
Well, reform isn't sort of doing well because, I should say, the Conservatives are doing badly that has allowed reform a way in, and I guess that's true. We look at those by-elections, and let's be honest, it was a poor result, and it was a disappointing result. And what Conservatives got to do, because they have the future in their hands, they've got to say, well, how are we going to connect back with the public? How do we get that trust back with the public? How do we deal with immigration, legal and illegal, and how are we going to get the accounts back on track? So I would say, look, it was only a couple of years ago in 2019 that we had an 80-seat majority, so actually things were going well. But the things that have gone wrong is, and the world stopped with COVID and lockdown, and it's fundamentally turned everything round. £400 billion was spent on supporting the country, and when you spend £400 billion and you lock the world down, it's no surprise now we're in a very bad way. So we've got to come out of it, and that is what we are doing. Now, it's going to be a hard slap back, but we are doing it
already.
that.
I mean, these by-elections, one of them, the Conservatives suffered their biggest drop in vote share in any by-election since the Second World War.
Yeah, and I've just said they were a poor set of results, and I'm not going to shy away from that. But what we need is unity of our MPs in the House. You talk about the different factions there. You're quite right. We've always been a broad church, and I'm proud of the fact that we've been a broad church, and we also believe in free speech in our party. But people have got to now get behind Rishi Sunak, who actually inherited a difficult set of circumstances, and say, yes, he has turned the economy round. That is turning round now. When you talk about inflation...
Just gone into recession? No, the UK's just gone into a recession.
Yeah, OK. Those figures were from the end of last year, and you're right, it was a technical recession, and it's a shallow recession. But what he's done, and he said, I will get inflation down because that is the most important thing, which he has done. Wage growth now is higher than inflation. They are now also starting to turn the tax round take it down. And I hope at the budget more tax will come down. But yes, that's what we're doing. Like Labour, they say you spend your way out of debt. What a load of nonsense.
Okay.
They say you tax yourself into growth. What a load of nonsense. The Conservatives have the solutions for the issues at hand.